So we're still in the morning. Good morning, everyone. It's our honor to be here, and I am the moderator, so I'm going to keep my mouth pretty much so closed the whole time, unless we get to a point where there's no questions. So it's our honor to be here today for the second annual MCPA HammerCon. In the list of those who were in attendance or being presented today, it's phenomenal. So I'm really proud of MCPA for putting this on and then inviting us, some of the senior enlisted leaders from Cyber Command, to be a part of this. So our esteemed panel here has been introduced, but I'm going to let them take a couple of minutes to kind of introduce themselves and talk for a few minutes about their interests, their experience, and things that they look to for the past, present, and the future.
Hey, good morning, everyone. As mentioned, I'm Sykes. I'm at Fleet Cyber 10th Fleet on the staff and the N5 plans and policies, but I don't do anything plans and policies. I mostly have been assigned a task currently working on getting after defensive cyber operations on our float networks at sea, as well as part of a couple executive steering committees for ratings within the CTN community and career specialties. Previously, I was a sub guy out of Groton, Connecticut on fast tax. FT and converted in 2010 over to the CTN community and getting into cyber. I was stationed in the old TAO, now CNO. Been stationed at the White House doing computer network defense for White House Communications Agency. I was at NICWEDGE. Saw some of my shipmates in here from the CWE and CTN developer community when I was in the N5 there. And now, like I said, Fleet Cyber. Mostly, my biggest thing for this is trying to get our modern technology into our somewhat outdated fleet on the afloat units. They are still struggling with some of the same things they did. Some of the technology that's in place is really developed in the 80s and 90s and still in place today. So that's one of the main efforts we're getting after now. We're also getting after how do we tackle this whole cyber community in general.
Hey, Chief Master Sergeant Patrick Nunes, call sign Snape. I can get to that in a minute. I've been serving in the Air Force for 17 years. I started in what is now our 1 Delta career field, which is more in tune with the comm IT background. At about the 10-year mark of my career, I switched over to our cross-train only AFS, which is our 1 Bravo AFS. That is the AFS that we force present to Cyber Command for our operator work role. What's great about how we've designed that career field is essentially stood up and born to force presented to Cyber Command. Because it's that niche AFS for the Air Force, it's very easy for us to kind of build those operators specifically for the requirements that we have on these NMTs and these CMTs and these CPTs. We get to look at all the airmen that apply through our cross-training program and hand select kind of the best from other Air Force specialties. They don't necessarily come from the traditional comm IT technical background always. A lot of times they do. But we have a lot of folks come in from, our security forces background or maintainers on aircraft. And what's great is we get to look, not necessarily just on whether or not they are technically capable, but we get to hire folks into our AFS that show just the propensity for, maybe maturity or the ability to serve in a technical capacity, even if they don't necessarily have that background. We, as an AFS, have done a great job of building our technical school to make sure that they can get that technical training. And that way we get to prioritize those high performers. The con there, right, for our AFS is that we're bringing these folks in a little later in their service, right? A lot of these guys and gals are coming in, somewhere around the 6 to 8 year mark of their career. And when you kind of build out all the training that goes along with not just training into that new career field, but then all of the follow-on training to get proficient in some of these work rules for CMA. There's a lot of time added on to when they come into our career field, and where we probably have a big challenge for our AFS there is that then by the time they're actually proficient in their career fields, they're starting to promote into more senior level positions in the Air Force. So it's kind of, for us, it's looking at, how we built the career field to be able to deliberately hire these folks and make sure that they're mature and capable enough to serve in such an important mission. But then also, how do we build them a little bit younger? How do we bring them into this community a little bit younger so that we can ensure that we have them on keyboard a little bit longer? So that's kind of the background, I guess, to the 1 Bravo AFS. The other AFS being the 1N career fields. Those are more of the analyst type positions on our mission teams that we build out from the Air Force AFSs. It's a much larger portfolio for the Air Force than it is the 1 Bravos. The 1 Bravos are very niche, whereas the 1N is a much larger portfolio that expands well beyond Cyber Command. So while it's great that we can bring them in younger with those AFSs, the challenge there is they have priorities well beyond Cyber Command and CMF requirements, and so we need to ensure that those airmen are expanding their experience beyond cyber, because as they grow into senior enlisted ranks in their career, they're going to have to lead airmen and joint members with different backgrounds and experiences, and they might not necessarily come from cyber background. So that's a little bit about the primary AFSs that the Air Force presents to the cyber ops domain. My call sign Snape. One thing that the Air Force, I think, does really well, at least on the cyber ops community, is we prioritize not only being technically smart, but ensuring that our airmen come into this community really indoctrinated and ingrained into the operational culture. So we adopted, kind of that fighter pilot mentality and the culture that goes along with that. We do naming ceremonies. There's a lot of heritage involved with our cyber ops community in the Air Force. We don't, unfortunately, do cool call signs like Iceman or Maverick. Instead, we go nerdy. So Snape is my call sign. Well, actually, to be honest with you, I can't share the actual story behind it. Unfortunately, Air Force culture dictates that there's an adult beverage in hand while sharing the story, and I don't have it with me at the moment. So that's my backstory for the Air Force. Thanks.
I think I saw some bourbon back there. We can go grab it real quick.
Yep, got it.
Yeah,
That's wow. Are you?
there we go. Keep going. I'll change here. Hey, good morning, everyone. Hi, my name is Jason Bryant, Senior Chief with the United States Coast Guard. Currently the Senior Enlisted Leader for the 2013 Cyber Protection Team. And this summer, I'll be assuming the duties as the Coast Guard's first Cyber Missions Specialist School Chief. So I'll be responsible for being on the team to help build out the Coast Guard's Foundational Training Center for Cyber Excellence. And I think all things looking right, we'll be joining our Army brethren down at Fort Eisenhower later this in a couple years. So excited about that. I've been in the Coast Guard 20 years. I've been started out as a bosun mate, driving boats, doing search and rescue stuff, and then joined a command and control rate as an OS, and then spent a lot of time over in Africa helping teach other countries how to protect themselves against piracy and some other nefarious things. And while I was over there, I was introduced to this concept of cyber and IT more from an electronic warfare and SIGINT kind of capacity, kind of nibbling around the edges of what cyber is. And then little known fact about me, I'm technically a CTT3 in the Navy. So when they sent me through an exchange program through the CTT schoolhouse and went through their pipeline training and came out and tried to bring some of that in the Coast Guard. So nibbled around the edges. I actually just came officially into the community not that long ago, about a year ago, and excited to be a part of the Coast Guard's efforts to join the rest of our teams. As we all have been doing cyber, Coast Guard's been doing cyber for over 10 years now. We're just officially calling that now. And some exciting things happening in the Coast Guard. As I said, our cyber schoolhouse, that means there's got to be a cyber specialty or MOS. And our cyber mission specialist rating for the enlisted career fields will commission this June 12th. And so we'll access our first 133 cyber mission specialists into the Coast Guard, and in the next few years expand that out, hopefully to the 500 to 600 range for the Coast Guard. we're right there alongside our service brethren as in the offensive cyberscape as well as defensive. It's kind of cool to hear General Alexander in the initial part talk about what he thinks is forward in that public-private partnership. And the Coast Guard's unique in that we can play in that public-private partnership a lot better than our DoD, not because we're better than them, not by we take a lot of our cues from them, but by our authorities, right? So the Coast Guard has the authority to operate on U.S.-owned privately networks and use some of our law enforcement regulatory capacity for that. So we're excited to use that to help protect the nation and serve the public and serve globally as well. So looking forward to a great discussion. Thank you.
Okay, so that's the opportunity for these three great, fantastic senior enlisted leaders who are also operators to be able to present. And at this time, we'd like to open it up for questions. And you must ask a question or we sit here all day and look at each other. Got one back in the back.
What's your opinion on enlisted developers, developers in the enlisted ranks, and also the training pipeline there?
Yeah, so if I'm just, sharing an opinion on enlisted developers, why not, right? We, the One Bravos, have plenty of enlisted developers. This community is very challenging to build talent, right? It's very challenging. So I think where we can find talent, enlisted or officer, shouldn't necessarily matter. We're not finding, at least in the Air Force, any issue or challenge using enlisted members and using them in a development capacity. The training, we already have, a pipeline path to build our developers in the Air Force. I don't know if maybe you could elaborate on kind of what you mean when you're asking that question.
Yeah, so there's an argument, there are many arguments for and against enlisted. I'm sure CHA Sykes can go deep into this, but there are many arguments for and against. One of the arguments is that enlisted developers tend to get trained and then get out in service because effectively they just get paid a whole lot more on the outside. There's the argument of if that's the case, then maybe we want to have bonuses, maybe we want to make just officers. Developers maybe want parts, right? They want that to go around where we can allow the enlisted developer to have promote to a place where they are compensated well enough, so that they will maintain it, so we don't squander that initial training that is so valuable.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I'd counter and say that argument can be applied to just about any work role within CMF. I'm completely honest, right? We have that same issue and challenge with our operators and analysts, right? As we grow, these talented folks in these positions, they're gaining experience and expertise that is hard to replicate anywhere else, right? And so it affords them a lot of opportunity. I think from the Air Force, if I'm looking at kind of incentives, right? I think we're going in a good direction, if I'm being honest with you. I think currently there's probably something left to be desired when it comes to kind of how we incentivize. If you kind of look across how the different services are doing it, each service has its own different priorities, right? When it comes to how we, of course, present the cyber domain. And the Air Force, I think, honestly, based on conversations I've had with current talent managers at headquarters, right, there's definitely a lot of conversation that I think, is generating in a good direction to incentivize at least our airmen. And that will include developers that will look at how we can prioritize making sure that they stay in the mission that we've grown them in.
So I'll go next. That's louder. I'm pretty loud, so can we turn this down just a little bit? Thanks. I have a lot on this one. Nick Witch started this fight in 2016. I got there in 2017, picking up the reins. And the Navy is really attacking this and taking the approach that our enlisted community is just as smart as some of the college trained, right? So where we can take somebody that may not have a computer science background and start them from 0 to hero. I think Nick Wedge started that that fight and did really well at creating a pipeline. Problem with one command owning it is we need it now to go on. So it takes time to build some of this stuff. Some of these people in the room have watched me with that fight for 3 years, and then we finally got the training tracker NEC created for the CTNs that have been through the pipeline, so we can start tracking that talent that have gone through it. And then other commands are starting to jump on board now outside of Nick Wedge for needing for develop from a red team perspective, from even CPT perspectives. NC Doc jumped on board. Even our special warfare community started snagging up sailors who went through that pipeline, and they see the need for that talent. I think the hardest part, and as Chief Master Sergeant here mentioned, is how do we keep it? How do we keep those people engaged? One, it comes from a desire to serve and be part of something bigger, but we have to do better about managing our talent. When we take, and I think one of the biggest challenges over the last several years is taking someone who we've spent a lot of money and training in, and then they go from being a developer at Nick Wedge from a Navy perspective, and then we send them to a watch floor somewhere else. And when you do that, that's when I think the real problem comes in, where we've created kind of, I don't like the word disgruntled, but just for lack of better words, it creates kind of this fire inside. And they're like, well, I love coding. How many people do I don't like coding, right? And all of my CTNs who I worked with at Nick Wedge who all coded knew that, but I love serving them every day. And I think that's our bigger key is we have to figure out what our sailors, our airmen, our Coast Guard, and our Army and Marines, what makes them tick. And if we can figure out what makes them tick, we can keep them. It's just a matter of you have to be able to serve whatever their desires are. I think that's our bigger challenge.
Ditto. Ditto. I don't know if I could say it any better. I will say this though, U.S. Cyber Command. I think we've really followed this old conventional and necessary model of how we deploy and manage our workforce. And I think U.S. Cybercom coming in as an innovator in a lot of ways is kind of not breaking the mold, but evolving how our service manages our workforce talent. And I know Coast Guard Cyber Command, along with other folks, are looking at the things like the assignment process and how we manage our workforce and why do we need to move them every 4 years, and what is the value of diversity of skill set versus specialization of skill set like the Air Force has. And so I know with the Coast Guard, we're having the same conversations. We currently bring in our cyber folks at E5. Maybe we should bring in at E4 so we train them a little earlier, keep them on keyboard longer. And yeah, of course, there's monetary incentives and interventions like retention bonuses and stuff that we're just never going to be able to pay what the private sector does. We're just not. That's not what we're here to serve. Not that, and we will try to do our best. But I think some of the other incentives that we have are the fact that we can allow a member, whereas if you go into the private sector, you're going to get pigeonholed into whatever you chose, right? Where there's a flexibility among Cyber Command for us to say, hey, you want to be a developer and be a great developer, maybe we can find a way that you can continue to do that while doing some other great things. But then let's say there's a chance for you to continue your education in other areas that you would not be able to do in the private sector. So I think there's educational incentives that are unique to our services that we can market, I think, a little better. I think we are looking at assignment processes and workforce management there. And then, how the stovepiping, right? So, at some point you break up to a point where you're in a community and you're not leaving that community. But when does that happen, right? So I think those are some great questions. I don't think we have all the answers yet, but I think we are learning and we're agile and nimble enough right now. We've got, certain lines on stage and other folks who are nimble enough to ask those questions and the right people in the right room to kind of think about it. So I'm actually really optimistic out into the future. It's a great question, and I think we're all looking at asking the same things. I don't know if that answered the question, but I'm excited about that.
Yeah, if I can just pile on real quick, one thing that I kind of see, at least for the Air Force, for the 1 Bravos, we send them, an exit survey as they leave service, right? So not all answer, but the ones that do, they're not typically saying, yeah, I would have stayed if you offered more money, right? Not to say that money isn't a factor as to why they're leaving. More often than not, the answer is, I'm leaving because I want to stay technical, and the service just doesn't have that path for me, right? We don't have a warrant path. I know the Air Force's stance on a warrant path. I think that's okay. There's other ways we can get after ensuring the airmen stay technical. That's something that we're working through. It takes a lot of deliberate development from the career fields to do it, especially if you kind of look at the leadership track, which the Air Force is kind of not even just the Air Force, but really just the service path of building someone up to E9. We don't need every person that becomes an operator or developer to become an E9, but that's kind of how the path builds us, right? They lead because they want to stay technical. So it's really just how do we reshape a framework to ensure that they can still stay on keyboard past E7, right? Because we're going to have a lot of challenges keeping people in, and they're not, necessarily in the same vein as, they can leave and still serve their country, right? They can still be a developer serving the same mission, whether or not they're wearing the uniform or not. So they can still have that, service to country in their heart, even if it's not necessarily with rank on their sleeves.
So just so you know, I almost had the sense I've talked into Div and the Air Force warrant officers. I think she pulled on me on the last minute. So great comments up here. I think we have another question here.
So I sort of asked, cyber is touching everything, so right? What we decided to do in the Army, I would speak for the Army, we started requesting more. We either started requesting having cyber folks go all the way down to echelon, and the brigade, division, etc., which takes them away from keyboard and everything else. My question is, considering the number of units we need to have for cyber people in general, if we're pushing them down to echelon and brigade and stuff, and they had 1 or 2 17 series soldiers and cyber soldiers, what are our concerns with them falling off the keyboard and not doing anything other than the tactical Army stuff that the rest of us, the Air Force guys do, etc. So they're not doing cyber, they're just playing and buying cyber stuff. Is that the right thing to do? And what are our concerns with doing that to those soldiers as far as like them getting out because we disenfranchise them because we send them to a tactical unit as opposed to like a cyber unit or a CMF, etc.
It's the Army question.
Yeah. Sorry, I could translate it to Navy too.
They have the same issue.
So I kind of mentioned I'm working on some DCO float stuff for the Navy. One thing I have seen, right? So now you got. Let me preface this with I have nothing against ITs. Okay. Our cyber component on a float right now, with the exception of from a Navy structure, with the exception of aircraft carriers. Aircraft carriers do get a small group of DCO afloat CTNs that will deploy. Outside of that, it's ITs. The problem is this: you have an aircraft commander, who's in charge of maybe that destroyer, not cyber background. If we don't push the cyber knowledge out to some of those levels, cyber takes a backseat priority because what's the military designed to do? I like my favorite saying, warheads on foreheads, right? If it's not a warhead on a forehead, it takes a backseat because that ship or that tank or whatever, right, go across whatever service, is meant to put a warhead out there. If it's not doing that, it's back here on the priority list. So when we're talking about making sure our ships or our airframes, right, because everything's across the net now, especially with the F-35s. Right? Like if we don't understand cyber outside of the cyber community here, then how are we protecting that stuff? How are we getting better at defending it? How are we getting the information from those things to our defenders who are sitting in some, like for us, it's over at NCDOC in Virginia. If the information is not getting there, how do we know? So somebody on that local defender level has some knowledge now. That's why I think it's still important. It may not need as many. We need to assess what's the right amount and at what level, but we still need them outside of just this community here.
I'll just speak on the Air Force. To be honest with you, I don't really assess that to be an issue. At least how we force present to the cyber ops domain. Our 1 Bravos, it's a small AFS. It's very niche. It's very much built for the NMT, CMT, CPT type structure. So the battle ops positions that exist for those mission teams. That's essentially what our AFS was built for. It's not to say that we don't have a portfolio beyond Cyber Command. But if I'm being honest and I'm looking across the mission sets that our 1 Bravos are in, they're gainfully employed in a good way, right? It's not to say that there's probably not a one-off airman that's not, leaving with that experience and that background. I would not say that it's probably not the commonality, right? I'd say for the most part we have our airmen in the right places.
I'd say for us, it's a great question. I think the Coast Guard, we're still so small. I don't think we have that unique service. Although we are looking to do exactly that, we do need to put folks in what we call our districts and sectors, which are similar to not similar, but at that lower tactical level. And for the same reason that the senior chief says, if we don't have representation there, we cannot engage and do our jobs back at home. So having representatives down there at the tactical levels, talking to the tactical commanders and stuff like that, and remind them that there's a cyber presence, a cyber component to this, and it's not a support element, but an operational element is important. When we do that, right, is the question, on-ramps and off-ramps. Your concern is that technical expert we've invested a lot of time, money, and talent into that member. When do we off-ramp them for maybe a short pause into maybe something like that where they can be in an advisory position, and then on-ramp them back on when necessary? And I think we're still trying to figure that out, but not everyone is going to always want to be on keyboard at all times. That's something else that I think is fortunate for us. Life is life. Folks have families and other things that happen, and so there may be natural pauses that we allow us to off-ramp them temporarily that benefits the member and benefits the service, and then on-ramps them back on. So that's kind of what we're looking at for us.
Going back kind of a little earlier to the discussion about retention is in the services, especially in the cyber domain. What's like the issue at the senior enlisted level that you're facing hardest that are preventing you from making decisions regarding retention faster, harder? What's stopping you from being able to do some of those actions that you're like?
And quick repeat the question for the folks listening at home who could not hear it.
Can you repeat it for me?
So in regards to retention, especially in the cyber domain,
Yeah.
Yes. Clock's running.
Sure. With retention issues, what's preventing you from taking actions with regards to those retention issues faster and taking them harder to keep people where you want and keeping those retention issues away from our services?
All right, so that's a tough one. I think right now, like the Navy in general, right? It's being talking to, I'm in a lot of working groups with the senior enlisted and how we're going to tackle this in the community, right? First thing was the whole new rate thing first, but now they're exploring other things like can we give SDAP, right? So like when you think of when special duty pay was assigned originally, it was for key component positions. Cyber was not considered one of those. So like now you got to look at policy. Is it placed, right? You got to change policy. That takes time. But then what's the appropriate level? Can you tie that level now in order to make it work to a basic journeyman master level skill set? Can you, right? So there's many different things to explore, but mostly it's the way policy was written around it. It doesn't quite line up with what we from just a retention standpoint. So I think the big thing right now is like, how do we do it? Is this the right answer? Because you can't just auto promote outside of ATF of coming out of a technical school for the Navy at least. So what else can we do? But I still think it boils down to figuring out, like Chief Master said, is keeping people technical, and how do we solve that so that way it doesn't look like they're stagnant? Because if you look at any precept for advancement or anything like that, it says broaden your skills, breadth of knowledge, sustain superior performance across multiple things. So, and changing a culture is, as he also said, right, is something that's not designed for keeping someone in one specific career if that's what they want to do. Does that make sense? Does that answer it? Kind of. It's going to take time because it's not fast.
So one of the things they have to consider, each of the services are responsible for their own retention, right? So one of the things we get asked on a regular basis is, why do they not look the same across the board? Well, it's because each of the services are responsible for. And so that priority is placed by the service. So he touched on it, but the speed and agility comes from that. So each year is reevaluated as to what is important and where the priority goes. And so if people are keeping people in, guess what? They typically don't have a retention bonus or something like that. As Senior Chief mentioned earlier, education being one of those. It's a huge incentive for these young operators. They really like that as a retention incentive.
Yeah, and just to kind of add on to what's already been said, right? I mean, it comes down to, you know, how the different services do talent management, right? And not every service is doing it the same way, right? If I'm looking at the Air Force, we do, as staff, we don't do proficiency pay. You can't just necessarily throw money at a problem on the assumption that it will solve a problem, right? Yes, retention could be considered a problem, whether or not money is necessarily, you know, the thing that's going to fix it. You need data to support that, right? These senior leaders at headquarters can't just say, yeah, let's just run money at it. That'll solve it, right? There needs to be something that backs, right, the informed decision there. So the technical piece, I think, at least from the enlisted side, is probably the bigger priority, right? Less about the money, but more about how do we ensure that they stay technical. When I went out to visit our schoolhouse, you know, with my previous talent management hat on, you know, I met some of the airmen out there, did a town hall with them, and they asked them questions. One airman stood up and said, "Hey, Chief, you know, what does it take for us to just, you know, be technical always?" I had to educate the airmen, you know, understanding that they're in service, right? They essentially were alluding to the fact that they didn't want to have like supervisory responsibilities and mentoring and coaching airmen next to them, right? You know, they're still in the service, and so I think that question really stood out to me. They signed up for this career field with the full intention to be technical always, right? And I think that's the challenge is as we bring them on board, helping them understand the community that they're actually joining is not necessarily just to be on keyboard hacking things, right? They're in the military serving beyond the technical capacity. So yes, they get to be technical, but they're going to grow in different ways. So it's not just how do we ensure they stay in on the back end, it's how do we grow them from the front end to make sure that they understand what they're going towards in the back end. If that makes sense.
I want to piggyback off something. He mentioned proficiency pay, right? Because that's something that comes up in the CTN community a lot. You got to figure out how to measure proficiency before you can just assign proficiency pay, right? And we don't have that framework built for a journeyman master type. How do you? Cyber's changing all the time in the sense of technology, right? So like, how do you keep up with that? How do you change that value that then says you can get this? And that's something we talk about every year at Rating Strategy Council with the senior enlisted leaders. Every year it comes up. The other thing he talks about is like, if everybody stays technical, who's going to lead these people? Because a lot of bigger complaints that I do here, at least within the CTN or in the Navy in general, is I got this guy leading me that doesn't know my job. So if we continue to if we bring others in to come lead these people because we let them stay technical, what do we do about the leadership aspect of it? So there's a fine balance there, and that's kind of what I think all of us are sitting here in the think tanks, not us specifically, but all of our services in these ratings is like trying to figure these things out, but not everything's going to be cookie cutter.
Yeah, I don't know if I could say much better than that, but I'll just add it that, you know, the Coast Guard, we do have a basically an apprentice journeyman master program, and so we are able to assign proficiency pay and special duty pay and bonuses and stuff like that with that. You know, and I think those comments are great. There's not much I can add on that because I agree at the macro level. But you know, at the unit level, at the tactical level too, I think there's a push too of assumptions. You know, there are ways to incentivize folks to be happy about their jobs and want to continue even technical. And I think a lot of those things, you know, the Coast Guard, we can be real flexible with our authorities, right? So if this is if this position is an E6 only position and this only an E6 can do, well, why? Why is it there's an E6? Why can't a high performing E5 begin to tap into that and maybe build their skill set, which then maybe allows them to stand a little bit longer, and something like that. So we're always looking at how can we push down while maintaining our professional edge. How can we push down some conventional thinking of, well, we're assigning this pay grade with this work role or whatever, because that's how it is, and saying, well, then we're glass ceiling some of our younger folks. So how do we allow them to kind of reach up and break through that glass ceiling? And we're seeing some success with that.
Hold a second. We'll allow everybody at home to listen to you.
So I just retired 2 weeks ago, so I'm gonna ask this.
Congratulations.
So,
Yeah.
so the question I have is, okay, so training. So I work for a company called ActiveBox. I think most of you are familiar with that. And so we talk with all the services. So we talk with the Coast Guard, talk with the Air Force, talk with the Navy, talk with the Army. The issue I see, and so my last job in active duty was the senior supervisor for cyber education and training. Everyone has a different way of training. Everyone has a different requirement. And so what's frustrating is, like, it's JQR, duty, workforce, work roles. It's, NIST, it's whatever the case is. How do we go from you have to take this specific course and just say, hey, as long as that course meets knowledge, skills, and abilities, you're blessed off on all those frameworks. So that's kind of the issue. And the reason I retired was because of that frustration, right? So what I've done at Hack the Box is I've built basically all those work rules to align those modules. So my question to you is, like, how do we get back to a standardization of this KSA and not tied to like a Cyber 1010, Cyber 1020, those types of courses? How do we, because the issue we're running into, and I think what people are getting frustrated about is that, a 17 Charlie is a good example. 36 weeks of training, okay? Before that, it was 52 weeks of training. So we were able to condense it. But they're in training for so long, so that means that's the less time they have time to serve, and then they're out. So is there a plan and I know Enlisted don't make the decision, right? So is there a plan or a messaging that says, we need to like unify what we're doing, have the knowledge, skills, and abilities to identify and to speed up the training?
So maybe a louder one now. I'll speak to that specific last piece just from the Coast Guard side, because I think there's some good news coming your way. And first, thanks for your service. Thanks for retirement. I can't wait to be where you are in a couple of years. But I think one thing too that change is incremental, right? So I think it takes a long time to make sure that we're making the right change the right way, and not just having to make change and then regress. But the reason why the Coast Guard's choosing to go down to Fort Eisenhower, soon to be Fort Gordon now, to the U.S. The U.S. Cyber Center of Excellence, is because we are taking a look at our foundational frameworks and saying, for instance, JCAC, right? So our one of the foundational schools down in Pensacola, love it, great school, amazing, but it's long. It's 6 months. To your point, a member gets there. If they're on a 4-year enlistment, which is plausible nowadays. We're trying to, we're considering 3-year enlistments for folks just to get them in the door. They do their 6 months, then some follow-on training, let's say 10, 12 weeks training. That's almost a whole year eaten up between PCSs and everything else that I've got to train, equip, and then have that person operate for me. So I'm looking forward to this new kind of agile idea of this cost phase 1, cost phase 2 approach at Fort Gordon, where we're going to have much shorter schools specifically designed to beef up certain foundational assets, and then relying on the units that they're going to that have different flavors already to do the specialization training, and then send them back to the schoolhouse for any other core foundational skills. And so not sure how it's going to work out, but I think that's a great way that we're going to try and switch it up and maybe break up some of those longer chunks, and that's the way the Coast Guard's committing to for right now.
So for the Navy, well, they passed their mic. Our first step when we put JCAC together in Pensacola was to go to 6-year enlistments. But we also, because it's a 6-month school, as soon as they graduate, they're seamen, and then they are automatically getting promoted to 3rd class. So it's called the ATF program for Advanced Technical Field. We're giving them that as soon as they meet the time. All they can do is do their minimum time and rate requirement, and they're handed 3rd class because of the technical ability. The other thing we're also working that you kind of mentioned with all the JQRs and all this stuff, and there's different all these classes. also have seat limitations, and when all the services are trying to throw their classes. So one thing I know that's being discussed a lot, I'm not in those discussions, but I know it is happening, is equivalencies. Do the services have schools in training that's equivalent to the same thing, because we can't get that NSA seat or cybercom seat or whatever it is, right, for different JQRs as far as the EAs, NEAs, and all that stuff. They're looking at that across the board because, yep, everybody did their own thing for so long. Now, how do we kind of undo this thing and kind of get back to a more joint environment, because we are a joint cyber fighting force. So,
As with the Air Force, you know, for a long time, so our AFS awarding course down in Biloxi, Mississippi, it's a 6-month course. It's JCAC equivalent, and so every airman that goes into our AFS, when they end that course, that you know JCAC is it's essentially what they're coming out of, right? They would then go off to a mission, right? Whether or not it was an NMT or CMT, CPT, etc. And then the training then varies for each airman based on where they get beyond that initial schoolhouse. That's been a challenge because what we find is that as the airmen start as a 1 Bravo in those first 6 months, they all have a common baseline there. But then as they promote into E9 and they're leading airmen across different backgrounds and experiences, the training doesn't match because their career path took different technical turns essentially after their technical training schoolhouse. So the only common baseline our 1 Bravos would have for a long time was essentially those first 6 months, and then beyond that, it really just depended on the mission you landed in, the training path that went along with it. We've done a great job, in my opinion, of working around the air education and training command framework. It can be a little rigid at times for honestly good reasons. If you look at the other AFSs that rely on that framework, for the 1 Bravos and cyber, it can be a little hard to keep up with the pace of cyber if you're kind of building the schoolhouse under that framework. So we've done a really great job of modeling the technical requirements of that schoolhouse to be a little bit more agile, really trying to feed new content into it. It's really reliant on the expertise of some of the fantastic instructors we have out there at that schoolhouse. But beyond that, what we are trying to do now is then build that framework to go beyond those 6 months so that all the 1 Bravos continue to kind of have a common baseline beyond that first schoolhouse, so that as we grow in our rank, that same training path exists for all 1 Bravos up to a point where then they can land the work.
Okay, I hate to say it, but that was the last question. I'm doing the hook.